Hi everyone, it is Driftwood once again for Gamerside, and today I'm finally allowed to tell you about Death Stranding 2. Thanks to the early code I was sent about 20 days ago, I've had plenty of time to prepare a proper review of Hideo Kojima's latest game. As I've also been busy writing a full review for the website, I clearly try to make this video review as short as possible, both to avoid wasting your precious time and to make sure you won't see too much of the game because of me. As usual, there's no need to worry about spoilers, and I don't even intend to show as many things as in the official videos, which, in my humble opinion, reveal far too many key passages. With that out of the way, it's time to get down to business, so here's my review of the PS5 Pro version of Death Stranding 2. "11 months after the events that saw him save the planet from final annihilation, Sam is living happily with his adopted daughter, Lou, who's grown up a lot since the day when she was still stuck inside that pod that made her a bridge baby. When we meet up with the two characters, they're on their way back from a short stroll in the mountains, it seems. Even though the world of Death Stranding is still very much hostile, Sam is no longer forced to confront the forces beyond his control, and he has decided to live as a perfect recluse in a bunker concealed behind a hologram simulating the presence of BTs. A pretty effective way to keep nosy people away. All seems perfectly peaceful when the adventure begins, but as you can imagine, this newfound serenity won't last much longer. The untimely arrival of Fragile, to whom Sam is still very much attached, quickly puts him back in the saddle. The chiral network is to be extended to his friend Deadman's laboratory in Mexico. Lucky for him, Bridges' former deliveryman lives near the border between the two countries. Initially reluctant to entrust Lou to his friend, Sam finally accepts the mission she's come to give him. It's the start of a series of events that will turn tragic soon enough, leading the hero to Australia with the crew of the DHV Magellan, a vessel/submarine capable of navigating tar currents. Whether they're old acquaintances, new faces, Death Stranding 2 takes great pleasure in making all these characters endearing and interesting. The writing and staging are a little less clumsy, I think, and the game gets to the point more often, particularly in its opening and in the way it sets up the stakes. You get to enjoy each cutscene with the same pleasure from beginning to end, even when it's just a simple conversation. Sam is no longer totally alone in the field. He can count on his teammates just as they know they can count on him, and the bond that binds him to them extends to the player. Before the release of the first Death Stranding, there were many questions surrounding what it would actually offer in terms of gameplay mechanics, and it's clearly for this reason that our video review at the time did so well. 6 years on, the concept may no longer need explaining, but expectations have grown. Between fans who want nothing more than a sequel on par with the first installment, and those hoping for a few in-depth changes to finally be able to appreciate Hideo Kojima's work, it's hard to satisfy everyone without hurting anyone's feelings. Recent previews had suggested that the sequel had the potential to make everyone happy, but I'm not so sure. On the one hand, it's true that the beginning of the adventure is more paced, thanks in particular to a prologue that condenses everything that was in the first game into one big, rather effective tutorial. Fundamentally, though, nothing has changed. The principle of the game is still based on the deliveries and journeys from point A to point B that Sam will have to make to link the entire Australian continent to the chiral network. The major difference lies in the greater freedom given to the player to do this. In the first episode, it took a long time for the vehicles to be handed over to us, and it seems clear that this frustrated many people. The topography wasn't particularly well suited for motorized vehicles either, so apart from the roads that could be built, there was less incentive to use them.
Come on, Sammy boy.
Right at the end of the prologue, we get to use a new version of the trike. It's still a 3-wheeled motorcycle, but this new model allows Sam to travel seated with his parcels in the back. The driving mechanic hasn't become a lot more interesting, but the surface is much more convenient to drive on, and the development team has also done some work on the bikes and trucks suspensions, it seems. You just have to get used to the extreme sensitivity of its steering. On our arrival in Australia, the rockier starting zone is a tad less easy to navigate on a trike, but it's still perfectly usable. It's a little clumsy at times, but thankfully the cross button allows you to bounce it around to prevent it from getting stuck everywhere. At the end of the day, it works well enough even on bumpier surfaces. Later on, you unlock an off-road pickup truck, which allows you to carry a lot more weight, but it's quite logically slower. The fact that it's mounted fairly high on wheels makes it very practical for crossing bodies of water, though, which removes a number of constraints that had to be dealt with on foot. And therein lies the potential problem some fans may have with this sequel. The entire world of Death Stranding 2 has been designed to be accessible to the two available vehicles. The logical consequence to this is that people are less inclined to deliver parcels on foot. On the one hand, it's more time-consuming, but also when you do it, you're choosing to put your goods at risk, from falls, rain, or even enemies. Not to mention that choosing difficulty over safety creates a real problem of ludonarrative dissonance. Why would Sam take more risks without any reason to justify it? During the first few hours, you may feel it a bit less, as vehicle batteries are fairly limited, but as it's easy to build a charger, and also because you regularly come across a vehicle abandoned by another player, it's always a little tempting to cut your journeys short. This is all the more true when you encounter BTs, even though they're strangely absent from this latest installment. When using a vehicle, it's indeed much easier to evade them and avoid combat altogether when you're traveling on 4 wheels. I'm not saying that the game forces you to play this way, mind you, except in the few cases where the load you have to carry is far too heavy for Sam's back. But I do think that many players will choose this option as soon as possible, perhaps thinking that later on, certain areas of the country will prevent them from doing the same. Except, no, if you liked Death Stranding for its long treks in the wilderness, you'll have to choose to play this way. Even in the high mountains, on snow-covered peaks, the trike's tires are fitted with blades that give it the grip it needs to climb the steepest slopes. It can't carry as much as the pickup truck, obviously, and it's true that in its basic configuration, the truck doesn't have the necessary power to reach the same heights. But as vehicles can be upgraded with more batteries, new tires, weapons, or even different items to make them more resistant to enemy attacks, this won't always be the case. That being said, you have to bear in mind that the first game also offered several ways of shortening Sam's journeys, with zip lines, for example, or even in the Director's Cut edition, the possibility of propelling Sam and his parcels into the air using special cannons. As I was saying, it's not easy to criticize the game in this respect, because ultimately you can approach deliveries in any way you like. Personally, I'd still have chosen to create areas where vehicles would not have been able to progress. But at the same time, as the distances are far greater, I understand that you don't necessarily want to spend an hour reaching an objective. Still, vehicles take away an important element of the gameplay, as they are not subject to balance management. Not that this is a very demanding feature in itself, especially as it seems to me that Sam is much more comfortable climbing steep slopes than in the first game. But if you want earthquakes, avalanches, or rising waters to have minimal impact on your gaming experience, you'd better opt for walking from time to time. Well, to be fair, these little natural disasters don't add up to much in the end, but they do add to the survivalist aspect, with heat, cold, and altitude taking their toll on the hero's stamina. But then again, all this only comes into play if you're willing to travel on foot. As Hideo Kojima and his team wanted to give the player more freedom, we're given many more tools with which to tackle situations that bring us face to face with enemies. The stealth approach is made a bit easier by the presence of a kind of taser gun, which has been added to the Ebola gun. Both allow you to take down human enemies without making a sound. Getting close enough from behind to tie them up is also simpler, as you no longer need to equip the rope to do so, but you still can't move stunned bodies. I also unlocked a sniper rifle, but without a silencer, and so it gave the alarm immediately even when I used it hundreds of meters away from the camp. Perhaps there's a version of this weapon with a silencer, as it is the case with assault rifles, for example, but I haven't found it yet. As long-distance aiming takes distance into account, quite logically, it takes a bit of practice to hit every bullet. Note that Death Stranding 2 no longer lets you kill human opponents. All weapons are designed to knock them out, and that's all. More surprisingly, even running them over with a truck can cause a void out. One thing I really appreciated about the AI was its ability to spot us from a distance, or even up close when we think we're hidden in the tall grass but sends parcels to betray his presence. I also think it's great that Death Stranding 2 finally incorporates a day-night cycle that takes into account the hero's visibility. Although personally, I'm a little annoyed that the nighttime passages should be so bright. Imagine the incredible atmosphere we could have had with nights as oppressive as those in Dragon's Dogma, for example, and what it could have been like with night vision goggles to complement the Otterdeck's manual light. On the other hand, you can unlock several outfits for Sam. Their descriptions suggest that he can be more or less visible depending on the type of terrain he's in. I never thought this was very obvious when playing, but as one of these suits was able to counter the explosive sensors sometimes located on the outskirts of camps, it was the one I equipped when a mission required me to retrieve something or someone from a human enemy base. There's also a suit that makes it easier for you to avoid being noticed by the new type of BTs, the Watchers, who should, put you under pressure at first if you come across them on foot. In fact, there are always several of them wandering around when you come across them, which adds to the stress and tension, especially as they're generally pretty resistant to weapons, when you have no other choice but to attack them. But as I mentioned earlier, despite the regular presence of rain, I find the BTs less omnipresent than in the first game, where we had to deal with them much more often. I can't tell you why. It's a simple observation I've made after spending over 70 hours in the game, but it's also been accentuated by the fact that the vehicles make it easier to get away more easily before they catch you. You have to face a few big ones as bosses, but there are also new enemies you come across. And they're not BTs, but they're still connected to the beach. There are no major changes in the way you deal with BTs, either stealthily with ammo grenades, or more frontally with weapons capable of causing them damage. Death Stranding 2 does add the boomerang, which is quite logical since we're in Australia. And when you soak it in Sam's blood, it can kill some of them in a single blow, provided you aim for their heads. It's also possible to sever the link between them and the world of the living by getting close enough, as in the first game. There's also a new type of grenade with a specific purpose, but I'll let you discover it on your own. Getting back to the bosses, they're all pretty cool, but lack a fair bit of variety in a way, both in design and in the way they have to be beaten. The staging, on the other hand, is very cool, and even if you can't use the dodge dive when fighting in the tar, I didn't have any major problem with gameplay, except maybe against the first boss in the prologue. Combat is still very straightforward, and in normal mode you basically only have to go in guns blazing. There's good feedback, a fair amount of slow motion every time an enemy is down, which is nice, but might also annoy some players, I guess. Once again, what's really nice is the sheer number of options available for tackling the different situations, with an arsenal that would not be denied by a certain Solid Snake, who by the way gets a few nods throughout the game. I'm also going to briefly mention the sequences in the World of the Dead. Not sure its exact name, but let's say it is. And those passages echo those in the first game where we had to face Cliff Unger, played by the excellent Mads Mikkelsen. I'm not going to say anything about, the person that Sam is supposed to defeat in each of these sequences, but they are built more or less in the same way as in the previous game. You can sometimes try a stealth approach, but as a general rule, at the end, you still have to face a mysterious enemy accompanied by soldiers, and you have to fight them to the death. The staging is as polished as ever, the different areas are all quite distinct from one another, and of course, there's the narrative incentive of the plot, which will only reveal its ins and outs at the very end of the game. So much for the quick, and note the air quotes, overview of the game's gameplay experience. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, although I could of course talk about the communal aspect of the game and the fact that more than ever, players all support each other. I could also have given you a bit more info on the added technological skill tree, also the fact that Sam's skills evolve depending on how you play the game, not to mention the few side activities on offer, such as capturing endangered species to bring them back to shelter, or even the different types of cryptobiotes to consume. But there you have it. I think I've already said more than enough for you to get a good idea of what to expect. Even 6 years on, the first Death Stranding does not disappoint when played on PS4, PS4 Pro, or even better, on PS5 and PS5 Pro in its Director's Cut version. Simply playing the very beginning of the adventure works marvel when it comes to the graphics, with Iceland-inspired landscapes that are just as stunning today as they were back in 2019. However, despite a partly similar topography with rocky areas and snow-covered mountains, Death Stranding 2 is far more ambitious in terms of rendering. For a start, the realism of character faces and facial expressions has taken a quantum leap forward in all circumstances. At no point can it be said that character modeling isn't up to even the highest expectations. They are so much more lifelike. The slightest emotional glance conveys the exact feeling it's supposed to evoke, and I dare you not to fall for Rainey's incredibly endearing smiles, which are a real pleasure to see in such a dark and tense story context. The lighting effects and the way lighting is rendered in general are another key factor in the credibility of the game's visuals, giving the various scenes a much more realistic feel, even during gameplay. When you're passing through areas that aren't directly lit by sunlight, you never get the impression that the game is losing visual power. Whereas it's often in such situations the varnish starts to crack in other games. The implementation of HDR also brings a lot to the table, and I'm sorry I can't show you that myself. Without going into too much detail here, Death Stranding 2 is truly a technical demonstration on almost every level. And even if I'm going to nitpick a few details later on, frankly, you're going to be blown away by the vistas and cutscenes. It was already mentioned in the May previews, but I can confirm that Death Stranding 2 also offers a greater variety of landscapes. That's not to say that there isn't a strong visual kinship with the first episode, and I regret that we can't take advantage of all the climatic and topographical richness of present-day Australia. But it would be a great act of bad faith not to recognize the effort that has been made to ensure that each region, each part of the world, is a little different from the previous one, and therefore has its own identity. Since I had stayed away from all the promotional videos apart from the very first one and a few passages from the January 2024 State of Play, and since they were both released long enough ago for me to forget much of what I had seen, I really did have the impression of discovering almost everything for the first time. And I think that's a fact that needs to be taken into account to understand the pleasure I was able to have in discovering them. Obviously, not everyone did like me, but having watched all the other promotional videos since I finished the game, I realized that Kojima showed far too much. I think it's a real shame, but at the same time, when you see that some videos were 10 minutes long or more, it's not very surprising when you think about it. So I hope that the people who let themselves be tempted are well aware that they'll be a little less surprised than the others. I was even shocked to see that some of the highly choreographed cinematics had been revealed in their entirety. In short, the lesson to be learned from all this is that when you're interested in a game or a movie, don't trust the copyright holders to protect you from certain types of spoilers. On the PS5 Pro, the game has two graphics modes, as on base PS5. One favoring quality at 30 FPS and the other performance, with a frame rate that never flinches at 60 frames per second. Visually, I find there is little to separate the two modes. When you choose quality, you'll notice that the level of detail in the distance is a tiny bit higher, particularly in foliage, and so pop-in is a little more discreet. But honestly, even when comparing these two images side by side, I found it very difficult to tell the difference. Still, there's a superior image stability on the most distant details, such as trees or certain surfaces, but that's the kind of thing you only notice when you're very close to your screen, so I'm not sure it's enough of a reason to give up 60. Apart from that, shadow quality seems perfectly identical to me, as do the rest of the assets and even the lighting, and the gain in resolution doesn't seem as marked as what I've heard from the base PS5 version. Having played in quality mode for a good amount of time, I can assure you that the frame rate is also very stable and the game is perfectly playable this way. In performance mode, it's obviously smoother on the screen, and I can't deny that it makes gameplay smoother too, but I don't think there's really any bad choice. It's just that here, there really isn't enough justification to do without performance mode on Pro. In fact, I think that most players will opt for 60 FPS, and they'll be right to do so. But if the very slight instability of the image, in the background, or the absence of the 4 blades of grass on the horizon bother you, then quality mode should do the trick. Having said that, I'm going to talk about the little details that bothered me from time to time. Let me warn you, this is really what you call nitpicking, but I'm not making anything up. For a start, there may be a few traces of shimmering on foliage. It's not systematic, but it happens in both modes. But it's not due to PSSR, which hasn't been used at all here. There are also some color banding effects in certain situations. In general, it's the kind of thing you can see quite clearly, easily in the sky, but here I noticed it more when I was in the middle of a snowstorm, for example, when the main color on the screen was white. I also think it's a pity that ground textures are so soft from up close. Although to be fair, you only notice this when you use the subjective view and you look at the ground, which you're not going to do in normal play. I also have some reservations about texture filtering when the viewing distance is high. As is often the case, this can be noticeable in certain types of landscape, and I thought I should mention it. There's also a kind of bug with the LOD that looks kind of bad. It happens when you switch to compass mode to look at the landscape in first-person view. You zoom in on a point where the ground textures are fairly basic and then wait for a few seconds. Then you see more detailed textures or assets load after quite a long delay, I would say, a few seconds. When you return to the third-person view, the newly detailed area remains so for a few moments before disappearing again. Clearly, this is a way of taking the load off the console, but it's not very elegant, is it? It also happens with vegetation, as you saw. That said, to be fair, during gameplay again, even when you're observing an area you have to infiltrate, it's not that noticeable because you rarely stand still and stare at a particular spot for several seconds in a row. Last but not least, there's always a certain clumsiness to Sam's way of moving over terrain on foot, and sometimes the hero's animations or feet aren't always perfectly in tune with the ground. Nothing catastrophic, nor very different from the first installment, but when you consider the quality of the rest, it's bound to be a little noticeable at times. Finally, I'd like to take some time to mention the excellent soundtrack composed by Frenchman Woodkid, and also all the songs from a wide variety of artists that we can now listen to freely during our travels, with the option to actually of making our own playlists, which is very, very cool. Low roar is of course part of the adventure, and it's obviously something to hear the voice of Ryan Karazija, who sadly passed away in 2022 from pneumonia. He was only 40. Reviewing Death Stranding 2 wasn't an easy task, and I'm struggling to get my head around the impression left by this video or the article posted on the website. I'm well aware that some people will mainly focus on the criticisms I've made, but I promise you that when I finished the game after some 60 hours or so, I found myself a little bit depressed. Not because I hadn't enjoyed the adventure, on the contrary. But you know that feeling you can sometimes get when you've completed a landmark title and you're wondering what the hell you're going to play next. You know, as if everything was going to have a dull taste now. It's true that I've made quite a few criticisms of the sequel, and even if some of them can be dismissed out of hand using the "you can play the way you want" argument, I still think that certain game design choices could have been different, and that sometimes imposing certain constraints on the player isn't necessarily a bad thing. Apart from that, I really enjoyed immersing myself in the Death Stranding world. I got very attached to the whole cast, and I thought the writing of the characters was really excellent. Inevitably, we'll all have our preferences, but I think Dahlman, for example, will be number one a lot. And that's no easy feat, since he's a character who's with us all the time in the field, and you know how that can go in some games. When you think that Kojima is already 61 years old, it's nuts. His approach to video games and the worlds he creates are so unique to him that, given the time it takes to develop a video game today, he probably won't be able to offer us tons of new games. For this very reason, I would advise you to enjoy Death Stranding 2, to take the time to play at your own pace, and don't hesitate to experiment, and like me, maybe cross your fingers so we can get a future DLC taking us to a new continent. It's certainly not Kojima's style, mind you, but if you don't want to have to wait at least another 6 years before discovering a new game from him, it could be a good compromise, don't you think? Well, that's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd like to remind you that even though we've been given a lot of time to prepare all this content for you, it took me, a good amount of hours of work, and that's not even counting the time needed to finish the game, of course. So please, show your support by leaving us a constructive comment, or even, let's go wild by giving this video a thumbs up to help the channel grow. It was Driftwood for Gamerside. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.